Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our event today entitled Art, Politics, and U.S. Sanctions on Iran. I'm Nargis Bajogli, an assistant professor of Middle East Studies at SAIS Johns Hopkins University. Today's event is a part of our Rethinking Iran initiative at SAIS, which has launched 13 reports from an incredible array of international scholars looking at the impacts of sanctions on Iran. These reports stem from our project entitled Iran Under Sanctions, which has been the first comprehensive look at US sanctions on Iran, studying the impact of sanctions on Iran's economy, energy, environment, social, political, and cultural sectors. For today's event, we consider the question, what impact have sanctions had on Iran's artists and art world? We're featuring the work of Professor Layli Soberni Mohammadi, a cultural anthropologist who studies Iran's global art world. Professor Soberni Mohammadi's research for this series has tracked 2 decades of art activity, charting sanctions alongside art exhibitions and other events across the art world of Iran and its diaspora to enumerate the consequences of sanctions on Iran's visual arts. Layli Soberni Mohammadi is a lecturer at the Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. She holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from New York University. Her research focuses on the art worlds of Iran and the United Arab Emirates. We have the great pleasure of having art historian Professor Talin Grigor in conversation with us today. Both Layli and I have learned so much from Professor Grigor's work. She's not only furthered the study of art history of Iran, but she's been very influential in helping younger scholars see connections and become more critical about the visual worlds of contemporary Iran through her innovative scholarship. Talin Grigor is a professor and chair of the Art History program in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on 19th and 20th century art and architectural histories through the framework of post-colonial and critical theories, grounded in Iran and Parsi India. Her books include Building Iran, Modernism, Architecture, and National Heritage under the Pahlavi Monarchs, published in 2009, Contemporary Iranian Art from the Street to the Studio in 2014, and the Persian Revival, The Imperialism of the Copy in Iranian and Parsi Architecture, which is coming out this July with Penn State University Press. Before I turn over the mic to our speakers, I'd like to invite all of you in the streaming audience, wherever you may be, to ask your questions throughout the event, either in the chat box on YouTube or on our social media via Twitter and Facebook. And our team will pose those questions to our speakers during Q&A in the latter half of the session. But without further ado, the floor is all yours, Taninja.
Thank you so much, Nargis. It's really an honor to be here in conversation with Layli. I really enjoyed reading her essay, and I look forward to this conversation. Layli, your essay was very unique in the way that it approaches this material. Sort of the contemporary art of Iran has been in news and in scholarship quite forcefully for about 20 years. And so this was an entirely new approach, an ethnographic approach to this material. And so it traces the varied ways that economic sanctions on Iran have impacted the production, the display, the sales, and in general, the environment and the discourse on visual art. And we see a symbiotic relationship between the art market, and the political discourses on Iran. So my first question is, could you, to start with, could you elaborate on your research method as an anthropologist in search of a set of data that would allow us to understand the rather covert, obviously intentionally hidden, correlation between art production and economic sanctions? What are the tools of sociocultural anthropology that succeeds to reveal networks and ties that are so difficult to uncover or even detect? So could you speak about your process and methods, please?
Sure. Hi, thank you, Tallene, for your question. Thank you, Nargis, for organizing this whole thing and having us both here in conversation. So to begin, yes, I am a sociocultural anthropologist, so my main method is surely participant observation and field work, which involved embedding myself, particularly amongst galleries and artists, both in Dubai and somewhat in Iran. But my work actually looks specifically at the UAE as a kind of node, in a node of circulation of Iranian art, and begins there and then sort of works outwards, both backwards and forwards, if you like, both backwards to an artist studio, perhaps to the site of production that may be in Iran, and both outwards to other sites of exhibition or collection or display. And so that meant while my main sites of fieldwork were in the UAE, I also spent a lot of time both in London and New York at art fairs, with galleries, interviewing a vast array of different voices. But I think what's particular to my work and what's sort of crucial here and perhaps distinguishes the kind of work other scholars might undertake is exactly looking at these sort of more hidden networks, looking at everybody involved, you know, so I really work from sort of Howard Becker's point of view of art worlds being a collective act that involves a great number of people, rather than thinking only about artists or only about curators or only about those sort of both producers and kind of gatekeepers, somewhat telling us what is worth our attention, or art historians even, for that matter. And so I think for me, it meant that when doing my field work, I was very much focused on talking to art handlers, talking to lots of the sort of administration, coordination, production people, also that are physically involved in getting things onto walls. And it so happens that my fieldwork coincided with the sanctions deal, both the sort of the beginning of it, the anticipation, the signing of the deal, the implementation date, all sort of occurred during the course of my fieldwork. So it meant that it came up, a topic that would come up over and over again from these multiple perspectives, right? Because on one hand, what does it mean for the artists themselves? But on another hand, what does it mean quite directly for the production coordinator, who's the person having to go and pick up the artworks that are stuck in customs, right? Who's having to deal with the paperwork to keep these things, artworks, sort of flowing and moving in some ways. And so that became a pretty integral part of my work. But yeah, I think in a way, anthropologists, we never sort of rule anyone out as an interlocutor, as a source, I think. And I think that allows for a really rich study that really goes beyond, what's on the wall, but how did it get there? What are the conditions that allowed it to be here in this particular time and place, I suppose, rather than investing only in the work itself and what the work is telling me, what the artwork might be telling us, I suppose. So I think that was a key part of my work. Yeah.
That's fascinating, and it really give us a 360 degree view of how actually art works. So in the first section, large section of your essay, you discuss the international exhibitions from 2001 to 2021. This sort of, and you demonstrate masterfully how there was this systematic international exhibitions, 2001 Barbican Art Gallery in London, 2004 TIMOCA in Tehran, 2007 Art Fair in Dubai, 2009 Asia House and Saatchi Gallery in London, 2009 Chelsea Museum in New York, 2013 Asia Society in New York, 2014 Musée de l'Art Moderne in Paris. So we see, you show us there was a systematic in this period of a vibrant activity that eventually gave birth to the market category of contemporary Iranian art. And that there was an attempt to play politics through these exhibitions. So I would love to know a little bit more about how you envision that these exhibitions were put together, organized by different entities. You have private museums, you have state museums, you had museums in Europe, museums in US, museums in Tehran. And of course, each of them, they have their own curators and artists, and each exhibition was a different kind of exhibition. So one was focused on the Pahlavi era, one was generically. Can we talk about a univocal sanction effect created through the discourse of these exhibitions, or there are more nuanced ways of talking about these exhibitions that are not necessarily diplomacy-driven discourse? So could you tell us a little bit about some of the nuances that is not necessarily entirely for or against sanctions?
Sure. So firstly, I suppose the exhibitions that I wrote about here are really just examples, I think, and there could be many, many more, and there could be many from different sites. I've used particularly sort of Euro-American examples and fairly big institutions for the most part, not exclusively. And so I don't want to, I'm not suggesting necessarily that there's a chronological order to what I'm talking about, but they are not necessarily of the same scale. They are not necessarily of the same type. Certainly, as you point out, some are private institutions, some are public institutions. But the point I'm making with talking about these exhibitions is that they're almost always, regardless of what the politics of the time is, if relations are cordial, as was in the case with the Barbican exhibition in 2001, or less so when Iran Modern was happening in 2013, when we're on this sort of precipice of cordial relations, just to keep using that term. I think there is still an underlying idea about art, as we know. This is not a new idea necessarily, that art is being used for opening up a discussion, for a sort of political goal in making us understand other people. And so in this case, it's absolutely this idea of the universality of art that is kind of triumphed through these exhibitions. So I don't think necessarily there's an overt argument for or against sanctions that can be found, but more of a broader discussion about politics itself between these, Iran as axis of evil, Iran as all of the things that we know Iran is described as, versus the West, let's say. And so I think all of these exhibitions do demonstrate that, and we can see that through some of the curatorial statements, right? Where the window onto the world, building a bridge, these types of things that are regularly discussed. And I talk a little bit about the anthropologist Jessica Winiger has written a lot about this generally in art for exhibitions of Middle Eastern art in the US post 9/11, right? And that's absolutely marshalling this idea that we all share a common humanity, and how can we see it through these very difficult times? Well, art is the perfect vehicle for it. And that's something that also complicates sanctions themselves, because sanctions themselves sort of pursue this idea by saying art is a protected category. We should value art. We shouldn't sanction art. We should allow the flow and the movement of art. However, we are going to make many other things surrounding that possibility very, very difficult, right? And so in some ways, then perhaps these exhibitions, we could think, if there is any univocality would just be that we can still do this, that this can still happen despite all of these restrictions, or despite what makes the flow of art, money, people, ideas more and more stretched, more and more contained, more and more difficult. So I think that's more how I would see these exhibitions, rather than there be an overarching or a linear, clear argument between all of them. But I think, there's moments. So with Iran Modern, it happens at this very particular moment, right, in which Rouhani is visiting the UN Security Council. It happens at this very particular moment. They also discuss, Melissa Chu talked about this, about being very careful and gingerly approaching the sanctions because of the kind of institute that it is, right? And how work was then brought into the exhibition. So you can see in some of these underlying ways too how institutions are themselves tackling this issue, whether overtly or more quietly, let's say.
Thank you. So one of the fascinating aspect of your argument was where you, in your third section on making artwork inside Iran, and you discuss the strategies of both controlling art production, art display, art market, but also the strategies of artistic survival within Iran, given the economic sanctions. And you talk about this structural fallacy or this structural gap between how art is supposed to be this protected, venerated, almost metaphysical creative process. The muse comes down from somewhere and the artist creates free of, everything. And so at that extreme, the art as this creative process that is protected from sanctions and any kind of political interventions. And then on the other side, where art is increasingly just another business. I mean, you sell tomatoes, you sell art, and so I love that structural setup that you argue. So could you talk about how exactly some of these chasms are created? So you talked about the SWIFT system. I thought that was fascinating, the way that is preventing the flow of this sacred thing that we consider art. Or you talk about cash in suitcase. I love that, this idea of people showing up to a very fancy Biennale in Venice with a whole cache of suitcase. And we're, I mean, this relationship between art and politics is not new to Iran. We have always had these sort of avant-garde, almost sort of crazy Sufi artists, 1950s surrealist, 1960s, the 5 Tehran Biennales. They were really groundbreaking. The Saqakhane School, the opening of Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, that was something absolutely new. It was the first museum of that kind outside the West. So, but all of these movements were either the court was the patron, or you had very radical non-mainstream artists who were sort of. So we do have that, but what. And then in the Khatami period, you have the Khatami campaign that uses art in a very uses aesthetics in a very intentional way, starting from the campaign to the success of. So your story is extremely interesting because it gets to the minutia of how these negotiations are done. This tension between art as just business and art as a venerated creative process. So could you go in detail about some of the strategies of survival that then meet the strategies of control, not just in Iran, but globally because of the sanctions, please?
Sure. So I think we have a few different things. So we have strategies of survival that I think we can think of in very concrete terms of but just of making, of what materials are available for making art? What materials are of good quality? What materials can I get repeatedly? And that shifts, as it does with many kinds of materials available in Iran, right? So can I talk a bit about an artist trying to using a certain pen that then later on cannot be found again in the art shop? Qualities of paper, qualities of paint, certain production, photographic production, which isn't not available because of sanctions per se, but just isn't available. You know, the way these things are changing, material technologies are changing, they're available in some places, not in other places. So I think that's always a sort of shifting landscape that absolutely is complicated by the sanctions. So there's that aspect. Then there's the aspect which is, yes, as you point out, the business, the good business of doing art, of art trade, literally, in which we have this this complication, this contradiction, where on one hand, art is allowed, art should be supported almost, art should be able to travel, but art is not. Up here, it is down here. It is gripped by the same mechanisms that undergird everything that we do, right? Which is, how do we literally transport this piece of art from here to there? And in that case, the issues around international banking are absolutely the same issues. And so then we have all of these kinds of creative strategies, which I also talk about, which are very legally gray areas, but are complicated yet again because okay, if you want to prosecute someone for breach of sanctions, in what jurisdiction are you prosecuting them? What is the evidence for doing that? You know, so there's lots of ways in which this gray area is exploited, I suppose, because it's so gray, because it would be so difficult to figure out. But it means, again, these very rudimentary strategies, which are money in suitcases, or which then mean, well, who does have mobility? And mobility is really a key issue, I think we could argue, in so many different aspects of sort of Iranian cultural production, I suppose, in a broader scale, who then is able to maneuver. And so then we have these figures that kind of emerge, not in a particularly organized way, but so what gallerist might have access to a bank account outside of Iran? What dealer might have access? Who might have more of that? People with dual nationality, things like this, right? So in which ways then, who can maneuver in this situation? Or how can someone pay for an artwork that they wish to buy that's outside of Iran, when they have no ability to move money from inside outside? Well, another figure is able to provide that service for them and perhaps, you know, take a cut. So it's a very gray, as I say, but very disorganized, I would say, but these chasms that open up and various people fill them. And I think also in the typical structures that one thinks about in the art worlds, that I think auction houses, you know, the typical, you know, Christie's and Sotheby's and all of these old trustworthy auction houses where it's all very sort of organized and as if it's very structured and safe. Well, actually, as they maneuver into these new markets, that's not necessarily the case. And lots of people come to figure out these gaps of how we're actually going to make this business work. Yeah, so then we have these just, then I think the roles also kind of get moved around, right? So artists may also be dealers because they may sell their works directly from the studio. They may sell their friends' works directly from the studio. The gallerist may also be moving various different kinds of things around. So I think then even this idea that in some ways it's easy to map out the specific roles of people within the art world gets much more muddied in a situation in which not everyone's role is as easy to do, let's say, as easy to create or to operate in. And so I think that's also something that happens that we can see here that I point to, and that also then, and if working internationally is a kind of key goal for many artists and galleries, and I think probably we can say that is for many people, people working in the contemporary art world across the world, right? If contemporary art is somehow a kind of global art, right? Something that can be everywhere, something that responds to our times, well then, again, how is that available to everybody? And is it evenly available to everybody? I think that's a key question, and it's a key kind of way of problematizing ideas about globalization, which sort of think that everything is sort of flowing and moving and markets are kind of clean somehow. Actually, that, you know, they're really not.
Speaking of markets, that are not so clean. Could you, I mean, it's just an extension of that, this conversation. Could you talk about the role of the Gulf states and how they further muddy these processes by becoming this middle place, a connection between Iranian artists, galleries, fairs. We know that in 2005, Christie's International opened its auction house in Dubai, and Sotheby's in 2009 in Doha. And incidentally, they wanted to open their branches in Tehran, but because of some of the sanction issue, I mean, the technological issues, the SWIFT system and other banking, they just couldn't. So they vouched for these Gulf states who were more than eager to house them. And so how does that impacted the muddying of everything?
So I think with the UAE, we have a couple of different things going on, right? We have firstly the idea of transshipment, right? The idea that goods move from Iran to the UAE to Dubai and outwards. And I talk a little bit about this, that they can then shipped by one shipper and then shipped by another shipper and sort of lose the association of the original location, and that's done across for all kinds of goods. So that's one sort of role that the UAE plays. Then, of course, as we know, as you point out, the auction houses that are opening there, the art galleries, the art fair, you know, so things exploded in Dubai and the broader UAE and in Abu Dhabi and Sharjah, obviously. They have been building their own art infrastructure for a very long time. And what do you need? You need artists and you need artworks to populate that. So I think it's the same time that things are getting maybe more complicated in Iran, things are getting more possible in the UAE. And so then that also becomes this sort of pretty obvious kind of first stop. And then thirdly, there's of course a large diaspora. There's of course lots of support, lots of interest, patrons also based in the UAE. So it's not just that it becomes a place for sort of moving things out or first encountering, but it also becomes a place for holding artworks, for collecting artworks, for storing artworks, actually, because as more and more infrastructure is also developed there. So I think that the UAE, Dubai specifically, plays this sort of multifaceted role and will continue to. And, you know, the UAE is also doing things. There weren't visas for artists. That has changed now. So there's a number of ways in which the Emirates itself is also shifting. Its infrastructure is constantly in development in that way. Its focus on the arts is constantly sort of improving, encouraging. So there's also Iranian artists based in Dubai who are working with support from, you know, Emirati support as well. So it almost becomes almost like a diasporic spot in and of itself, I suppose. And diaspora is a question that I'm sort of grappling with throughout my work, because I think it's just, things are more mobile than we might have been thinking or talking about previously. And I think it's really, there's lots of examples within the art world of artists, curators, writers, people who are going and coming, people who do live between these spaces, and which is much harder to say this is a diaspora artist, or as you talk in your book, you have the exile section, in which it's complicated, right? And so I think Dubai adds to that complication actually at this point. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yes. The last three sections, shorter sections of your essay, you discussed the nuclear deal in 2015, the maximum pressure of the Trump administration policies in 2017, and eventually in the withdrawal from the nuclear deal in May 2018 and afterwards. And we see the continuation of these exhibitions. As you note, in 2015, TIMOCA puts up the Lashai retrospective. In 2017, there's a very prominent exhibition in the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, 2018, their Tier Art Gallery in Tehran. So we definitely see both outside and inside Iran, there's no giving up of, even with the pressures, there's sort of life, it's a lifestyle, making art, going to galleries, purchasing art, gathering around artwork becomes a lifestyle that, despite sanctions and shortages, it seems that Iranians won't give up doing. So I want to, as an art historian, I want to challenge you with the question of aesthetics. So you write that in this dynamic network, the aesthetics becomes secondary. And then you add that though exhibitions of Iranian art are plentiful, the political context in which these are mounted limits the interpretation of the art on display. So I'm wondering whether we can think about the aesthetics of contemporary art, which adamantly sticks to being free, being in its language, in its use of material, in its medium, being just do as I feel. And so I'm wondering whether aesthetic really limits, or aesthetics really disables, or it's secondary, or precisely because there's an ambiguity and ambivalence in the aesthetics. Yeah, after all, it's just someone threw a paint on the canvas. I mean, so therefore, it could actually lend itself to a political discourse, to being sanctioned, to and whether the aesthetics of it doesn't necessarily limit the interpretation of art, but rather leaves their interpretation in a state of flux. So anyone could show up in front of any work and say, this is what it means. And so, so then how does that feed into strategies of resisting a specific political discourse, or actually feeding into it? So this is, I'm sorry, I'm throwing a disciplinary challenge, but I'm wondering whether ethnography has an answer to this.
I think that's a great question. It's a big question. I think on some levels, sure, you could make the argument either way. Perhaps I'm not wedded to that necessarily. I think maybe what I'm talking about, or maybe you're right in what you're talking about, is the aesthetics are somehow in flux or so open that they're open to interpretation. But then I think time and time again, those interpretations are made along a very sort of political and relatively closed context, actually. And I think, again, as an anthropologist, if we look, we can kind of maybe do a slightly better job of separating out an artist's intention, artists who are often very quiet about what their intentions might be, not always, but some, versus a critical reception, versus a curatorial framing. And I think that if we parse those things out, then I think that the political aspect, I think, is really crucial. And the reason I use those exhibitions is because at the beginning is because they're all happening against these backdrops. They're not just, it's not a quiet moment in which these things are happening. Is there ever a quiet moment? Perhaps we could say, but so I don't think they can be, we can say one is here and one is here, obviously, right? The art is political, the personal is political. I don't think we can sort of separate any of those things out. But yeah, perhaps I don't disagree that things that the interpretations are very open. But yeah, they tend to be made in a similar way, or partly I think with my work that I try to use this other location of the UAE, of a location that's sort of you know, not a Western, not the UK, not the US, not these big institutional exhibitions or places, to say, well, what is the interpretation in this location? Because they aren't always the same. Obviously, one of our big aspects in studying art is any kind of audience type of studies, right? That we can do. We've learned to do a little bit better in media anthropology. We haven't really learned to do very well with art, you know. So, you know, what is the general public's response? It's a kind of cloudy question that's actually, you know, very rarely answered. But I think that's a really crucial point as well in the locations of where this art is on display and then how it is interpreted. Yeah, that I think that's probably the most I have to say on that.
So thank you. And so the Gulf then, sort of, I was thinking about the way that certain artworks are being bought by certain clients. For example, when during my interviews, several Iranian artists were complaining about the opening of the Gulf states and the role of Sotheby's and Christie's as corrupting elements. Because now artists were producing calligraphy because they knew that Sotheby's would sell it, some sheikh would buy it because of their aesthetics. And their point of view, many artists in Iran, especially abstract expressionist artists, were complaining about this, what we see as a way out, an opening of a door against the sanctions. But that wasn't really how some of the artists, at least at that time, were looking at it, at least before 2009. And so I'm wondering what happened after. Your research was done after, obviously 2009 being an important marker, where there's a major shift where sort of the state withdraws its patronage of the arts. And you do talk about in your essay about how once that is done, the state withdrawal of patronage, then sanctions start to have even more impact. So your research is in 2006, 2016 and 17. And so what were some of these kinds of commentaries about what the sanctions have done or how the markets have done to the work itself?
So I think those commentaries still very much exist. And I think there will always be a sort of cynicism between different artists, feelings towards other people and their successes on some level. So I don't think that's disappeared. But I do think there's also a kind of narrative that the boom has happened and the boom is over. And in a way, perhaps, but in a way at the same time, what's happened in the UAE has also evolved. So the UAE as a site itself has kind of matured, shall we say. There's many more galleries, there's much more kind of critical work in circulation. So I think in that sense, what's happening there has also shifted. I think it's a challenge, isn't it? In an economically sort of tight and difficult situation, do we begrudge people who find a way out of that situation? I'm not sure. Do we also understand, you know, I think also again embedded here is this idea of, you know, art as a calling, as a avocation, all of these types of ideas of what art even is. And so a certain cynicism around being more instrumental about it, or being more economically minded about it. You know, it's not my place to sort of make judgments on either of those positions. I do think that still exists. And I also think in a kind of what I try to get to at the end of my paper is the point that, you know, artists, like all citizens in Iran, are facing pressures from so many different angles. And so the sanctions and these pressures are just one many, many pressures. And so I think in that kind of environment also, this creates different kinds of tensions amongst different groups and people working in, you know, different forms and different ambitions. And I think those remain regardless, or perhaps have even got worse since 2009. And I also say at the beginning, and I think all of my interlocutors want to say this, you know, there is a level of survival mode for everybody. And there is a level of, you know, everyone's enduring the same conditions and then trying to do this other kind of work, which is very challenging in many ways. Yeah.
I was fascinated by what you just said about the boom. You know, the contemporary Iranian art was a thing, a market category, a moment of fame, but now it's gone. And so going back and maybe sort of ending with going back to how we were talking about this chasm, that structural fallacy between art as metaphysical creation and art as business. And I was thinking about how sort of the boom that is over was actually the making of institutions like Sotheby's and Christie's and all the museums that put these exhibitions together. And now maybe they have moved on to something else. I mean, just like the way that Chinese contemporary art was a thing, and actually it started with the Soviet contemporary art right before the fall of the Soviet Union. They were something, and then people got bored, moved to Chinese contemporary art, and then it was Iranian. And maybe it is now that it's over, but precisely because of that fallacy that is created by these auction houses and people who buy it, and the incentive of the market. And so maybe we can end our conversation with this symbiotic relationship between Western states, Western institutions, and how they use sanctions to bring pressure to other institutions.
Well, just to say, obviously we all know this, but Sotheby's, Christie's, all the auction houses are businesses that are constantly needing to develop new markets. And so whether a boom is over or not almost doesn't matter, because they've now, at a market category, a market location has been established, which will keep sort of feeding and repopulating itself. And I think on some levels, this idea that we talked about a bit earlier about the diaspora artist, or about this very large, in a way, category of an Iranian artist that can basically be repopulated again and again and again on some levels, now that this category has been created. And that's not to say that people aren't making work regardless of these institutions producing a category, but certainly for a market to function, there's now a category, there's now a very distinct place in which to circulate, to sell. Right, and then there is also a way in which the category itself is quite big, quite amorphous, quite sort of able to contain so many things. And so that's, I don't think perhaps a boom of in and of itself is over, but it's actually here to stay, I would say, as the institutions move and will, you know, keep finding newer and newer categories, or keep stratifying their categories in order to sort of make more. Thank you.
So we'll move on to other questions that are coming up, both from audience members and myself, as I've been like scribbling notes as the two of you have been talking. So one, Layli, I want to get back to what you guys just finished talking about, which you were very careful in your piece, and I know in your larger work, to talk about artists as citizens, and you know that they are living through the similar things that other citizens are in Iran and other folks in Iran are, which is not just a contracted economy due to sanctions and mismanagement, but also repressive state policies, repressive state actions, being in this post-revolutionary space that constantly has these ups and downs on the political level, which then reflect themselves onto artists. And so, you know, in this kind of atmosphere that you're talking about, and as Taline was just asking you, from 2009 onwards, which so much has happened in this 11-year period. And in some ways, society has really, especially for those in the cultural sector, transformed quite significantly. How do not only sanctions, but the atmosphere that these kinds of political frictions between Iran and the outside world, and then how it's reflected in the domestic spaces, how does that come to both impact the artists that you were working with, the gallery spaces domestically, and then what this also means for what artists are expected to represent, whether on a domestic space or in these international markets, as these folks who come out of these quote unquote closed societies?
Well, so I think that's sort of going back to the politics, aesthetics, not division. It's not a division in any way. But thinking about then I try to get to this. Then the artist becomes the voice, and artists are sort of forced in this position. I think particularly as works are traveling out within many exhibition spaces. And so on one hand, perhaps as Taline suggesting, is that because things are so open to interpretation, but I also think it's because then constantly art becomes an instrument in which to understand the people as its sort of number one goal within exhibitions outside of Iran. And I think as things challenges in so many ways, challenges as economic challenge of the money that you have in order to build your space, you know, becomes less and less. What you have to pay people to work in your space becomes less and less, you know, all of these kinds of things then impacts. I just think an atmosphere in which you're working in that's almost, it's sort of worth saying, it becomes this like a tension, right? Just sort of a tension within that isn't necessarily you're able to pinpoint in any specific political situation or any specific legal situation or anything else, but just a difficulty, and we know that. And so I think that's what everyone is up against. That's what artists are up against. And I think to be squeezed into being a sort of voice of a society or a way of telling us outside things about a place, I think is an awful lot to bear. You know, it's a big weight for many that many artists don't necessarily want to fill those shoes, don't want to be in that situation. But at the same time, people want opportunity, right? And people want to take those opportunities as and when they present themselves. So I think it creates a kind of tension, internal sort of division of, you know, what, I guess this is a little bit what we were talking about with before with as far as the market's concerned, you know, do I make this move? Don't I make this move? These are sort of the questions and tensions I think that artists are asking or answering all the time. And I also think there's just this point that you know, I've written this paper, it's about sanctions and the arts. I've attempted to enumerate a few more of the issues, because it also becomes a very sort of fetishized situation in which, but look how creative Iranians are regardless of all of these things. And look how these sort of beautiful voices regardless of all of those things. And I think that's sort of what I'm getting to, is not everybody wants to be that voice. Not everybody is seeking out that aim with their artwork or their lives even to be put in that kind of situation. And I think in a lot of my field work, that was the tension that people were feeling, while at the same time, especially during just when the deal was struck, there was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of, wow, things will get easier. And we're talking both as far as sanctions are concerned and actually, you know, paying your artists when you sell their work abroad, and, you know, perhaps visas will be easier to come by. Perhaps it'll be easier to get that student visa to study elsewhere. You know, obviously all these things come hand in hand with many other kinds of restrictions that we all know about. So I think during the period of work that I was during the period in which I was working, there was a hopefulness that I would say has probably dissipated quite heavily.
Sort of picking up on that, you guys, you did touch upon this briefly in your conversation, but I would love to just hear you tease it out a little bit more. This question of who, in this sanctioned market, who has access to the outside world, often comes with folks who have a certain kind of cultural capital. And then that means that types of art circulate from certain sectors of society, and that then comes to represent quote unquote Iranian art. I saw this a lot with the type of research that I was doing in the cinematic world. And I don't know what the conversations are like among visual artists, but among filmmakers, this was a really big gripe for folks who didn't have that access to the outside world, and their work could not circulate because they didn't have family members or friends abroad that could help them, pay the submission fees to the film festivals and things like that, because they couldn't do it with credit cards inside Iran. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about that, and especially then what does, based on that, then what becomes Iranian art on an international market, and how does that either reflect or not what's happening on a domestic level?
Well, I think it's crucial to think any art world, I suppose, has many art worlds within it, right? And so, not every artist in New York is a contemporary artist who is showing at every biennale here, there, and everywhere, right? So it's the same thing, obviously, within an Iranian art world or within Iran. And so there's obviously hierarchies within different locations, within different cities, with the different kinds of art making that people are doing within, and certainly this question of access. And I think, again, this question of access is a sort of universal question too, that we could think about in many different art world, national art worlds, or many different places. In Iran, it becomes very specific, I suppose, because of some of the sanctions questions, or the mobility question, or the visa question, or those kinds of things. But on some level, these are similar questions everywhere, right? English being the international language of the art world, right? Being able to talk about your work in specific kinds of terms, all of those things which are as much about education as they might be about well, therefore also about finance at this point, also about economic access. And so I think a lot of those questions are questions we could pose in a way for a global contemporary art world, if we want to talk about one, and are questions that we can ask within art worlds everywhere, I suppose.
This, either of you can take up this question, but so then there's this new exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, called Epic Iran. And I just want to read out the tag that goes along with this exhibition. It says, exploring 5,000 years of art, design, and culture, Epic Iran shines a light on one of the greatest historic civilizations, its journey into the 21st century, and its monumental artistic achievements, which remain unknown to many. And so, things like this seem to pop up quite regularly, like these exhibitions that happen in London, New York, and elsewhere, where it's like, get a glimpse of this space that no one knows about. And it's really funny because it happens every few years. So one would imagine that if it's already happened at X museum or Y, why is this something that we've never seen before? But it strikes me as a non-specialist in this field, but I would love to know what you all think of how, both as a post-revolutionary society that sort of went against the West, but then also all of these different political elements that have come in and trying to politically isolate Iran, how that lends itself to this notion that this is an unknown world, this is an unknown space, this is, and come and see the art to get a glimpse of that. But I don't really have a well-formulated question for this, but it's just like, how and why does this keep happening? And creating these exhibitions of like 5,000 years of a civilization seems to be just interesting, for lack of a better word.
I can take that quickly. In my book that's going to come out, I argue that Europeans were enamored with the Safavid court. I mean, it was lavish. They had everything. It was like and once the Safavid fell and the Ottomans got defeated. So in 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz reversed the power dynamics between Muslim empires and Christian empires. And from then on, ancient Iran, this notion of 5,000-year history of this unknown, unknowable, mystical place that is Iran from ancient time, became a fetish for Europeans and very much embedded in European modernity. The very process of Europe, and of course, Said explores that. So I think the place of Iran in Europe's and in Western self-making, I see these exhibitions as continuation of that, of wanting to see Iran as discoverable. This 5,000 histories of great civilization that we know nothing about. And it needs to occur constantly because it's part of the discourse. And it needs to be systematic, and it needs to be repetitive because it's part of the discourse. That's my take on it, and I find it fascinating, but maybe Layli has a different take on it.
Well, I just wanted to ask you or wonder, what do you think though? Do you think there's also part of it kind of speaking back to a kind of European canon on some levels, a Greco-Roman canon? Or what about, you can certainly say more about this than I can, about nationalism, as far as, right, if we also think, as I keep saying within my work, of thinking of, you know, where also is the funding coming for some of these kinds of things. And as we know, we have a very large, vast, fairly wealthy diaspora. And so I also wonder what story, you know, I think these come from both directions, I suppose. So I find your point very interesting, but also who is it that is helping these things to reoccur actually also within Western institutions? I think that's an important point we need to unpick a little bit more.
We have, there's an audience question that wants to know before we wrap up our session, that would it be correct to say that there are disproportionate number of women artists among Iranian artists that are claimed by these Western art markets and circulations compared to art forms or art from other places? And if so, why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I wouldn't be able to say necessarily in comparison to other places. And I don't know, I haven't looked. Gender is not necessarily an aspect in which I don't use that lens necessarily to look specifically at the artworks. Possibly, like, I wouldn't be able to say in conclusively.
So the question is that women are more?
Yeah, the audience member is wondering, I think it seems to her that there are more women represented in Iranian art that circulates in the West. And is that so? This person is asking, and if so, why?
Well, certainly certain artists are much more, like Shirin Neshat, obviously is very famous, very much part of the American art history canon. I mean, like, she's part of the textbooks that we teach contemporary art. And that's a lot. And that's a big achievement in that sense. And this goes back again to the aesthetics of it. I mean, Shirin Neshat's first most visible exhibition were the Women of Allah, at again a very important period of non-dialogue between civilizations, and so I see it as also part of the discourse, the way that American museums, Western museums see themselves as some kind of institutions that are open and willing, and but very selectively. And these decisions to give solo exhibitions are very strategic decisions. And I think the BLM movement has showcased that very clearly. And that's why the museums are in crisis right now, precisely because these decisions are very strategic.
That's really fascinating. I would actually, so just as a quick follow-up before we end the session, Tallene, you're saying that the Black Lives Matter movement is really pushing this conversation forward when it comes to the strategicness of who gets showcased and why, and that whole question sort of goes into this question that this audience member is asking, and this broader idea of who gets showcased, especially as a solo artist, and what that means and the story that tells.
I think so, and this loops back exactly to Leily's argument about the correlation between contemporary art, about its Western audience, it's about its diasporic audience, about its state audiences, and the Iranian public, the Iranian art community, the Iranian elite intellectual community, and so I have always seen art as contemporary art in light of Leily's argument about how it's being weaponized and how it's being used as an ideological discourse.
Great, thank you. I think that's a perfect ending actually to this session. So I really want to thank both Tallene and Leily for this incredible conversation and for taking the time out to have this conversation with us. Thanks to everyone who's watching us wherever you may be. And we look forward to, we're going to have one last session for the academic year, which will be next week, about the politics of the presidential elections in Iran, and we'll be joined by journalists in Iran to help us sort of think through what's going on there. So we hope you all can join us on June 8th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Other than that, thanks so much to Tallene Grigger and Leily Saberni Mohammadi for this excellent session.